In 1947, a British lawyer was given just 5 weeks to divide a civilization. He drew a line across the Indian subcontinent, a place he'd never even been. And when that line became real, millions of people suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of history. When it was announced, around 15 million people were displaced, up to 1 million killed, all because a line on a map became real. A line is one of the simplest things humans could draw. A child can draw one, a ruler can draw one, a politician could draw one across a map. A line can be drawn in seconds. But once humans believe in it, that line can decide where you live, what passport you hold, what army defends you, and whether you're even allowed to cross. This is the strange power of borders. Most of the time, they're not even visible in the ground, and yet people have fought wars over them, died defending them, and risked everything trying to cross them. So why do humans divide the world in this way? Who decides where those lines go? And how did borders become powerful enough to shape history, identity, and culture? To answer that, we need to go back to a time before countries, before passports, and before the world was covered in lines. Okay, so here's something strange. For most of human history, people didn't live inside countries. There were no passports, no customs officers, no official line telling you where one nation ended and another began. But that doesn't mean humans lived without boundaries. Like many animals, early human communities defended territory. A group might control a valley, a forest, or a stretch of river. But these boundaries were not precise. They were not drawn with rulers. They were felt, remembered, defended. In other words, early humans had territory without borders. But then something changed. As we began to settle into larger groups, boundaries became physical. One of the earliest examples was Jericho. Around 8,000 years ago, a massive stone wall was built around the settlement. To those inside, the wall meant safety, order, belonging. To those outside, it meant something else. Exclusion, danger, the edge of another world. Later, empires built boundaries on an even larger scale. In northern Britain, Rome built Hadrian's Wall, a frontier marking the edge of Roman control. In China, emperors built an even larger frontier. Part defense, part symbol, the Great Wall represented a boundary between two worlds. On one side was Imperial China. On the other, nomadic societies beyond its reach. But these still weren't borders in the modern sense. They weren't invisible legal lines covering every single inch of the planet. There were places where power could physically stand guard. A wall says, behind this, our community is safe. A frontier says, behind this, our power is real. But then we realized something. You never needed stone to divide the world. You didn't need rivers or mountains. You didn't even need to visit the place. All you needed was a map and a line. At some point, a new idea emerged. Land could be divided not just by barriers, but by agreements. And those agreements could be drawn on maps. One of the earliest examples appeared in 1494. That year, two powerful empires, Spain and Portugal, faced a problem. Both were exploring newly discovered lands across the Atlantic. Both wanted control. And rather than fight a war over everything they had not yet conquered, they did something stranger. They divided the unknown world with a line. The result was an agreement known as the Treaty of Tordesillas. Everything west of the line would belong to Spain. Everything east would belong to Portugal. The remarkable thing was this. The line didn't follow a river. It didn't follow a mountain range. It was simply drawn on a map. Yet that line would go on to shape the future of entire continents. It's one reason why most of South America speaks Spanish today, while Brazil speaks Portuguese. But here's where it gets really interesting. This idea of dividing the world through agreements continued to evolve. 1648 marked the end of the 30 Years' War, a massive conflict fought across the Holy Roman Empire. One that would change the very idea of power and land forever. After the 30 Years' War, Europe was exhausted. Millions were dead. Empires, kings, religious powers had torn the continent apart. But the peace that followed did more than end the war. It helped create a new rule for the world. A series of treaties known collectively as the Peace of Westphalia established a principle. Instead of being tightly managed by a distant Holy Roman Emperor, rulers claimed authority of their own. Power became territorial. Inside this line, the ruler has authority. Outside this line, someone else does. This idea that the world should be divided into clearly defined states with fixed borders slowly spread across the globe. Maps began to change. Cartographers started drawing clean lines between nations. What had once been vague frontiers became precise divisions. The world of countries had begun to take shape. These borders weren't always created carefully. Sometimes they were drawn quickly. Sometimes they were drawn by people far away. And sometimes the consequences were enormous. In the next chapter, we'll look at some of the most arbitrary borders ever created and the consequences that followed. If the borders we live in today often feel permanent, history tells a different story. Once maps became powerful, one question became dangerous. Who gets to draw the line? Many of the lines that divide the modern world were drawn surprisingly recently, and in some cases they were drawn by people who had never even visited the places they were dividing. One of the clearest examples happened in 1884. That year, the future of Africa was discussed in a European capital. The meeting became known as the Berlin Conference. Maps were laid across tables in Berlin. Diplomats leaned over them with pens, rulers, and imperial ambitions. But the most important detail wasn't what was on the table, it was who was not in the room. No African rulers, no African communities, no representatives of the people whose land was being divided. An entire continent was being turned into a map of European ambition. Lines were drawn across deserts, forests, rivers. Some of those borders were almost perfectly straight, not because the land was simple, but because the people drawing them were so far away from its complexity. They ignored ethnic groups, languages, cultural boundaries that had existed for centuries. Yet many of the borders created during that conference still define African countries today. This was not an exception, it was a pattern. A few decades later, the same logic appeared in the Middle East. During the First World War, the Ottoman Empire was collapsing. Before the war had even ended, Britain and France were already imagining what would replace it. In 1916, two diplomats, Mark Sykes and Francois-Georges Picot, secretly negotiated a plan to divide much of the region into zones of influence. Again, the map came before the people. Again, the line came before consent. And again, communities living inside those lines had little say in the world that was being built around them. In some places, they grouped together communities who had almost no shared history. In others, they separated groups that had lived side by side for generations. This is what maps and lines allow empires to do. They could simplify places they barely understood. A valley became a shape, a tribe became a label, a living landscape became territory. But the strangest part is what happens next. People begin to believe in the line. Once a border exists, it can become something powerful. Not just a political boundary, but a symbol of identity. And this touches on something deeply human, our need to belong. But here's the strangest part. Even when borders are drawn by strangers, over time people begin to defend them as home. Throughout history, people have formed communities based on shared language, culture, and traditions. Borders help define those communities. They mark the space where one political system ends and another begins, where one set of laws applies and another does not. And in this sense, borders help organize the world. They're not just political tools, they're also powerful symbols. A border can represent the idea of a nation. Political theorist Benedict Anderson described the nation as an imagined community, the sense that millions of strangers belong to the same collective story, the same history, the same future. Flags, national anthems, and borders all play a similar role. They help transform large populations into something people can recognize as a country. Yet this creates an interesting paradox, because borders are both incredibly real and strangely abstract. They shape laws, economies, and international relations, and yet if you stand directly on most borders, you won't see anything unusual at all. Often the only thing marking the boundary is a sign or a checkpoint. The power of the border comes from something else. It comes from the shared agreement that that line matters. Many of the systems that organize society work in a similar way. Money, for example, has value because people collectively agree it does. Laws function because societies recognize them as legitimate. And borders exist because governments and the people living within them recognize those lines as meaningful. Without that shared belief, a border would simply be a mark on a map. With it, the line can determine where someone may live, where they may work, and sometimes whether they're allowed to cross at all. But if borders can define belonging, they can also create separation. Throughout history, borders have not only divided land, they've divided families, communities, and entire societies, sometimes gradually, sometimes overnight. In the summer of 1947, the British Empire was preparing to leave the Indian subcontinent. For nearly 2 centuries, Britain had ruled a vast region home to hundreds of millions of people. But as independence approached, tensions between religious communities were rising, especially between Hindus and Muslims in the region. Many leaders believed the land could no longer remain one country, so a decision was made. The territory would be divided into 2 nations. Pakistan would be created as the homeland for the Muslims of the subcontinent. India would remain a secular state with a Hindu majority. To draw the border between them, the British government appointed a lawyer by the name of Cyril Radcliffe. Radcliffe faced an extraordinary task. He had been given just 5 weeks to divide a region that had been connected for centuries. And of course, there was another problem. He had never even visited India before. Using maps, census data, and political negotiations, Radcliffe drew a line across a map. It became known as the Radcliffe Line, and when it was finally announced, the consequences were immediate. Millions of people suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of the new border. Families fled their homes. Entire villages began moving across the landscape. Historians estimate that 15 million people were displaced. In the violence that followed, as many as 1 million people were killed. Imagine waking up in the same home, on the same street, under the same sky. but being told that overnight your future had changed. The land had not moved, the roads hadn't changed, the fields were still there, but the map had changed. And because the map had changed, life had changed with it. Another striking example came in the middle of the 20th century. In 1961, authorities in East Germany began constructing a barrier through the city of Berlin. At first it was barbed wire. Soon it became concrete walls, watchtowers, and guarded checkpoints. This barrier became known as the Berlin Wall. For nearly 3 decades it separated families, friends, and neighbours. Streets were cut in half, buildings stood with doors facing a wall. Some people attempted to escape, many succeeded, but others were caught in the attempt. More than 100 people lost their lives trying to cross from East Berlin to the west. When the wall fell in 1989, crowds gathered along the barrier that had divided the city for a generation. People climbed onto concrete slabs, they chipped pieces away with hammers, and for a brief moment, one of the most visible borders in the world simply stopped existing. Yet in other places, borders remained deeply entrenched. On the Korean peninsula, a narrow strip of land separates 2 countries that technically still remain at war. The line is known as the Korean Demilitarized Zone, the DMZ. It's one of the most heavily fortified borders on Earth. Fences, landmines, guard towers. But beyond the military presence lies a quieter tragedy. When the violence ended in 1953, families were divided by the new boundary. Parents separated from children, siblings separated from siblings, and in many cases they never saw each other again. Decades passed with little contact across the border, lives unfolding on opposite sides of a line that had not existed only a few years earlier. Examples like this remind us that borders are never only political decisions. They shape human stories. They influence where people can travel, where they can live, and sometimes whether families remain together or are separated for generations. So borders begin as decisions, a treaty, a map, a line drawn by someone somewhere at some point in history. But over time, those lines become part of real life. They become passports, checkpoints, flags, homes, memories. They decide who belongs and who can cross and who's kept out. And that's what makes borders so strange. Because most of the time you can't see them in the land itself. The earth doesn't change when you cross one, but your rights can change, your safety can change, your future can change. History shows us how dangerous this power can be. Borders have divided families, cities, and entire civilizations, but they've also given people identity, protection, a place to call home. So maybe the lesson isn't that borders are fake. They're far too powerful for that. Perhaps the lesson is that borders are human creations, and because they're human creations, they come with human responsibility. We may still need borders, but we should never forget what exists on the other side of them. Not enemies, not strangers, not just another color on a map. People, with families, with memories, with hopes, with lives as real as our own. Because every border was once only an idea. If humans were powerful enough to draw lines across the world, then maybe we're also wise enough to make sure that those lines never matter more than the people living on the other side. If this video made you see the world a little differently, please leave a like down below, subscribe, and comment down below any other topics you think I should cover. Join our community here on YouTube where we discuss a range of intriguing topics, and share the video with anyone who's interested in learning about why we do the things we do. And with that, I'll catch you on the next one.